Welcome to the show. Violent protests erupted in Charlottesville, Virginia, putting President Trump under scrutiny again this week. While critics say the president waited too long to speak out against White Nationalist Group, the president says he was simply waiting for all of the facts. And of course, then again later this week, he gave us some more facts. I'm not sure if they were the facts, though. Henry, what do you think?
Well, I think in this case that unlike his predecessor who was quick to make statements, I think he really wanted some things to settle down and collect a better idea.
If that's what comes from sitting down and waiting, I mean, do you agree that this first statement could have been a little bit more eloquently worded?
I think many of his statements could be more eloquently worded. Going out, and this is the first real crisis that he's had to deal with on a national level since he stepped in as president, as far as a riot and protest.
So you think he's going to get better?
Lord, I hope so.
Ron?
That was a classic. I love the way you finished that. I really like the way you did that. He wasn't waiting for facts. He didn't know what to do, and he was forced to do what he did.
And you know that based on what?
His past. I mean, the bridge over that somebody ran folks down overseas, he commented before it even was finished. All other things he comments before they're finished. In this particular case, we seem to be starting on Saturday when we should be starting on Friday night with what happened with the clergy in the church, with what happened with the tiki torches and the march and the things that took place where they actually held hostage the clergy that was in the church for over 30 minutes. That's the type of thing that it started with. It didn't just start Saturday with a car. It started Friday night. I don't hear a whole lot about that. So they knew Friday night.
Do we hear that from the media anywhere at this point? I haven't heard a lot about the Friday night activities. The focus has been Saturday and the loss of life of this young lady.
Yeah, that's Friday night is when this whole thing really got out of hand. And if you would have heard the supremacists that spoke, they were prepared to do what they did, which was violence. They promoted violence. The people that are talking, that are being interviewed, there's HBO, part of it on HBO will have it. They will show you what they actually said on specific interviews.
So Ron, answer me this. Do you think, based on what you have heard and seen so far, the facts that you have gathered, do you think there were those on the other side that wanted violence as well?
Tell me what you call the other side.
So
counter-protesters.
Yeah, the counter-protesters.
Well, a counter-protester is going to be there to protest their own community when they knew that there was going to be the action taking place in the park close to the monument.
But did some of those want violence? Is that clear to you?
I don't. How do you ever know if somebody wants violence? When somebody comes in and they're already armed with military uniforms, packing heat, what do you expect?
But I guess in my stead here, Ron, I am no way endorsing the fact that what these individuals had to say, okay? But they had a right, and they petitioned and were granted the right to have an assembly. The counter-protesters weren't. So if the counter-protesters would, let's say 2 blocks away and not intercede, but at least get their moment in the spotlight, but not interact with the other ones, we never would have been talking about this now. What we're doing as a society today is grabbing hold of that camera, and we're shifting the focus on whatever our issues are. And they inserted themselves into a situation that they knew was going to be volatile.
Well, did they know that?
A supposition is going to be people who hate just about anything but a white person is probably going to, you're probably going to run some clashes.
I would argue that my supposition would be that people that hate anyone that's not white are just plain idiots.
We can add on to that supposition.
So, and whether idiots bear arms or want violence, I don't think in my mind is a clear. I think some of these people did, but I don't know how these counter protesters. And I get the point. I get the point about the fact that they didn't have a right to protest. They didn't have an assembly permit or whatever the case may be. But I don't think that explains away. I don't think that's the
There's
one
no
and only excuse.
Okay, what created the problem? I just want people to understand the problem started Friday night. The problem didn't start with the permit to have a peaceful assembly at the monument in the park on Saturday. The amount of bad things that happened on Friday night, where the slurs of blood and soil, the assertive we're not going to be replaced by a Jew, the constant barrage of what happened on Friday night created the atmosphere for Saturday. Please use the facts where they are.
But they would not have assembled had there not been a decision to remove the statue in the first place.
They weren't there on Friday night.
But what I'm saying is there likely would not have been a protest and a march had a decision not been made to take down something that's been standing for 105 years.
Does that make it right that it was standing?
No, but there's a lot of things that occur in our society that offend yourself, myself, and Jim that we may not like, but we are bigger individuals to ignore it and move forward.
Yeah.
So I would say, and I don't know whether if it were my decision, I would tear the statues down. I don't think the statues are a good thing. But I also recognize the fact that the easiest way to repeat bad history is to forget about it. And I think at some level that is a reminder of a very disturbing time in our history.
I think we should actually emphasize our Civil War history and the time between the victory of the Revolution to the Civil War period. I think we should put more emphasis on that in school so we can learn and become a better society for everybody.
But then we don't idolize the people that started it. Robert E. Lee was trained where? He was trained at West Point. He was a member of the Union, of the United States of America. He got his battle scars and he's fighting in Texas with Mexico. He came over and then became involved in the Civil War. He was actually asked to command the Union and he turned down Lincoln.
Okay, let's turn our attention just for a second to the vehicle attack. Was that an act of terrorism? Ron?
Absolutely was an act of terrorism. How could you look at anything else? Here's a white supremacist that gets in a car that had no business being on the street. There were cars blocked at the end of the street anyway, so he couldn't have gotten through if he'd have wanted to get through. And you could see from the back that he rammed people.
Henry?
Plain and simple act of terrorism, and regardless of whether it was a white supremacist or some other faction. Okay, let's take that. Using a vehicle as a weapon is an act of terrorism. Okay, in my book, he deliberately inserted himself into the situation as an act of terrorism to maim however many people he could get. It created a mob mentality of the individuals there, both for and against his own jaded opinion, created a mob mentality of people cheering and jeering him that only excelled the situation and then caused the loss of life of 3 people.
He's from Ohio. The people he ran into were from Charlotte, so they weren't bussed in from someplace else or drove in. So that made
well, 2 of them were police officers that worked locally.
But the police officers were in the helicopter when the helicopter went down. So
Go ahead.
I just, as this whole thing unfolds, when you talk white supremacy, when you talk Ku Klux Klan, when you talk this whole bunch, all of them give us a problem in America.
Should we pardon the term, whitewash history and let's move past the KKK. Let's move past the white supremacy. People who have legacies that are tied to this, okay? A former senator in West Virginia. Should we ignore what he has done in this world because he was a part of the KKK? Should we ignore what Strom Thurmond did because he was part?
Let's do this. If Strom Thurmond would have come back from the dead and Bob Byrd, Senator Byrd, come back from the dead and been part of that action that night, they would have been wrong. There was people actively involved that night, and when you see the transcript, not the transcripts, the actual interviews from people that led the different groups, when you see the things that they say, you'll say there is no place in the United States of America for that type of person.
We've got about 2 minutes left. Let's talk about going forward. Racism is not a trait that we inherit. Racism is learned. It's learned maybe at the family level, it's learned maybe at a school level. Wherever it's learned, we know that it's learned because white babies don't come out of the womb saying, I hate African Americans or Mexicans or Japanese or Chinese or whatever the case may be. Same thing on the other side. How do we fix this? How does this all end? Because quite frankly, I look back at, and there was a KKK rally that was supposed to happen in or around Washington County near the Antietam battlefield. And what 2 people showed up?
It fizzled.
Yeah. And why? Because I would hope there were only 2 people that
But
would
that
believe
one
that.
didn't fizzle the other
But
night.
that's my point. So what is fueling, are we back
Dog
at a
whistle
point-
politics from the top.
And
And it's been
perhaps
going
the
on for a
media?
decade.
Yes.
So it didn't start Friday night. It started a decade ago. It started maybe with the election of Barack Obama because the people that were hardcore white supremacists, that was probably their worst case scenario come to fruition.
Well, one thing for sure, ISIS has been replaced by what you have right now. We don't have to worry about fighting ISIS because we're going to be fighting ourselves, doing the same kind of a damage that ISIS would have done.
Ron, you were involved in the military back in the 60s.
Yes.
Okay, you saw what the country in turmoil was.
I was in the riots. I was in 3 riots.
So you were there.
Yes.
Comparing that time frame to this time frame,
Far worse now.
far worse now.
Far worse now. Far worse now. If you would have seen, which I watched all of it.
Is it level of vitriol in the fact that we have perpetual Internet of Things and 24/7 cable news and everyone wanting their 15 seconds of fame? Is that what's stoking the fire?
I'd say it's our smartphones and things that give instant access and instant
social media?
gratification, social media, the whole thing. And of course, stirring the fire and pouring gasoline on the fire at the very top doesn't help anything.
No, it doesn't. Next up on the flip side, we'll discuss the controversy behind a natural gas pipeline finding a new home below the Potomac River in Washington County. Stay tuned. We'll be back in 3 minutes with that report.